Mr. Speaker, when Sir Walter Scott wrote that in war both sides lose, I'm not quite sure he'd factored into the equation the likes of the Houthis, because they are, of course, the fundamentalists, and unperturbed by the bombing that they have been on the receiving end of from Saudi Arabia for many years. The perceived wisdom would suggest that they are perhaps not just content, but maybe even quite happy to be on the receiving end of American bombs. And it is in that context that that poses an enormous question for all of us in this House as to what comes next. If, as has been suggested through their actions over the course of the last 12 hours or so, the message which we sought to send has not been received, then what do we intend to do? What is the plan? What is the Prime Minister's strategy? Will he come to the dispatch box and, unlike his predecessors in relation to Middle East conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, lay out when and how far he is willing to go in relation to military action? Because quite clearly, we need to understand his government's strategy in this conflict, because we cannot have an escalation which leads to further regional instability. And of course, whilst we would all agree, quite rightly, that we should not fall for the Houthis' narratives that this is directly related to the conflict in Israel and Gaza, we cannot escape from the fact that a ceasefire in Gaza is essential for that wider regional stability. And finally, Mr. Speaker, whilst the Prime Minister has sought to defend his decision not to come to the House last week, it is quite clear that this House should have been recalled. It is what the public would have expected, and I would urge him to do better in future.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank the honourable gentleman for his comments about Ukraine and support for our approach. With regard to the future, I obviously won't speculate on future action. What we conducted was intended as a single limited action, and of course we hope that the Houthis will now step back and end their reckless and destabilising attacks. But of course, Mr. Speaker, we will not hesitate to protect our security and our interests where required, and we would of course follow the correct procedures, as I believe we did so in this case. And although the honourable gentleman is right to ask questions, but we should also recognise the risks of inaction. Because doing nothing would absolutely weaken international security and the rule of law. It would further damage the freedom of navigation and the global economy. And perhaps most importantly, it would send a very dangerous message that British vessels and British interests are fair game, and that is simply unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. And lastly, if I might say, and of course I'm happy to answer questions about the situation in Israel and Gaza, but this House should be very clear in making it clear to the outside world that there is no linkage between what we have done last week and the situation in Israel-Gaza. This was a specific action in self-defence against the Houthis, who are conducting illegal strikes against innocent civilian shipping, and that has nothing to do with what is going on in Israel-Gaza, and we must never let anyone think that this House believes that there is.